The big bond is one of those innovative ideas that we've come up with to help increase the amount of funds available to African or ADF countries for development. The big bond is essentially a way of front-loading finance to the ADF countries without increasing the fiscal burden on donors who are already fiscally and, in a sense, politically strapped because of their own problems at home, which are well known. So the big bond is a very simple idea. It's the idea that you set aside of the portion of the $45 billion in grants going to Africa every year and use that to help to raise a significant sum of money upfront. To take a concrete example, if you set aside $5 billion at prevailing interest rates in the US Treasury market, you could use that to essentially finance the principal and interest payments on a $100 billion bond today, which means you get $100 billion upfront and you set aside a fairly small fraction of the total amount of grants going to Africa over the next 30 years. Africa is yet again at a critical juncture. The Africa Rising narrative has been tarnished because we see today a combination of slowing growth on the continent and the resurfacing of public debt sustainability problems roughly a decade after the balance sheets of the governments were wiped clean through the HIPC MDRI debt relief process. At the same time, we are trying in this environment of slowing growth and intensifying public debt sustainability problems to reconcile two things. On the one hand, dwindling ODA because of the problems that the donors are facing in their own countries, the fiscal problems, the political and social problems. And on the other hand, vast upfront development financing needs Africa has if it is to have a fighting chance of meeting the SDGs by 2030. The first and most important reason is that the African Development Bank Group is African. It's on the continent. It has offices throughout the regions and throughout the continent. It can convey tough messages, the sort that the World Bank and the IMF located in Washington, D.C. may be reluctant to do. The second is a deep realization today that donors can only play a catalytic role. African leaders have to take the initiative. It is they who must carry out the difficult institutional and policy reforms that will rejuvenate the African narrative on growth. Third, in this partnership, the African Development Bank is obviously in a position to play a key role. One of the things that is lacking is collaboration across the different multilateral development institutions working on Africa. And clearly the African Development Bank Group can spearhead this process. This is extremely important today because there is a crying need for rejuvenating the growth story in Africa and making sure that it's in a position to have a good chance of meeting the SDGs. Donors should be interested for two main reasons. The first is that the big bond would actually lower the fiscal burden on them because it amounts to taking a portion of money that's now given as grants and converting them into loans. The second reason is that this is once again, the signal transmitted by the big bond is extremely important, that it's time for the African leaders to take the initiative to shift the center of gravity to the continent. And therefore, the donors, the way I see it, have a rather stark choice today. They have a choice between sticking to a system of official development assistance that is having a tough time delivering adequately on two key objectives. One is public debt sustainability. The other is a strong foundation for sustained long-run growth. Adopting the big bond and going ahead with it and coming up with the upfront money vastly changes the incentives for African country governments to engage in an enhanced policy dialogue to make sure that the money is well spent and that African growth returns and the public finances are sustainable. This will, of course, help with the regional security issues. It will reduce the incentives for the young people of Africa to get on those dangerous boats and try to cross the ocean in order to go to Europe. So it contributes in several ways. It is a win-win situation. The first and most important comparative advantage of the African Development Bank is that it's African. It's located on the continent. It has field offices throughout the continent. It's able to speak the same language. It understands the culture. The president of the African Development Bank and the institution as a whole is in a position to convey the kind of tough messages that the World Bank and the IMF located in Washington, D.C. might be reluctant to do. The second reason is that the big bond is not simply about money. It's a signal, a very powerful signal, that Africa is open for business, that African leaders have, from now onwards, to take the initiative on the continent's future. The donors can play only a catalytic role. The African leaders must, at this stage of Africa's development, implement the very difficult policy and institutional reforms that are needed to make sure that the African narrative is once again restored in a positive sense.